Cast your mind back to 2022. Russia had just launched its full scale invasion of Ukraine. Nuclear rhetoric was back, loud, deliberate, coming from the Kremlin. The arms control architecture that had held since the Cold War was visibly fraying. And the NPT Review Conference walked into that environment and collapsed. No outcome document, no consensus, a failure. Now it is 2026, and if you thought 2022 was bad, look at where we are. Russia's war in Ukraine is in its fourth year. Nuclear signaling from Moscow has not stopped. It has become normalized. New START expired in February with nothing to replace it. France has announced it is expanding its arsenal and embracing strategic ambiguity. Iran's nuclear facilities have been struck twice, and states that once would have never entertained independent nuclear deterrence are now openly discussing it. In a couple of weeks, states parties to the NPT gather in New York, and they will have to navigate all of this. Is there a path forward, or are we watching the slow motion unraveling of the most important arms control treaty ever negotiated? To discuss this, I'm joined by Dr. Olamide Samuel, Network and Engagement Specialist at the Open Nuclear Network, and Dr. Manuel Herrera, Senior Policy Fellow and Program Manager of the Nonproliferation and Disarmament Program at the British American Security Information Council. Hola, Manuel. Welcome to the Nuclear Table.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Yes, many thanks for your invitation. It's wonderful to be here.
So, to get us started, Ola, Russia pulled the plug on 2022 in the final hours over Zaporizhia. But was that the cause of the failure or just the trigger? Because underneath it, all the nuclear weapon states had already coalesced against meaningful disarmament commitments. It wasn't just Russia. How deep do the structural fractures actually run?
I think, and I'm just going to cast my mind back to the review conference of 2022. I vaguely recall a lot of delegations sighing in relief when Russia was the one that decided to finally pull the plug on Zaporizhia. That's how watered down and papered over the language in that document was. It was a document that walked back significantly on nuclear disarmament commitments. It was a document that missed some specific um, references to agreements from the 2010 review document from the NPT of 2010. And so, many states were on the edge with regards to whether or not they want to be the bad guys to destroy consensus. Hence the sigh of relief when Russia stepped in, pointing to Zaporizhzhia. I think if that document in 2022 was accepted as an outcome document, we would have had a much different nuclear order now because, at least regarding Pillars 1 and Pillars 2 of the treaty, we'll have seen much more of a walk back on the accepted political commitments that states have made to this treaty. But on the other hand, we will have seen an acceleration in Pillar 3 commitments with regards to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So, on one hand, we lost a valuable document that would have accelerated adherence to Article 4 of the NPT, but on the other hand, maybe we dodged a bullet that would have signaled uh, you know a catalyst for the erosion of political commitments that were secured in 2010 and 2000.
No, I want to actually do a follow up on what Ola just said because it's true. One of the main concerns that emerged during the review conference in 2022 was whether if that outcome document finally passed, it was an outcome document, a consensus based document that, although I don't fully agree on the notion that it would be a setback on some of the pillars, it was vague enough. language based, vague enough that the content per se was not meaningful in terms of, you know, actually having a serious and and coherent or exhaustive analysis about the degree of implementation of the treaty. So of course, one of the main things that it's always discussed in the context of refcons is like, oh, we need to have a language that we all agree, but agreeing on every single language has the inconvenience of being utterly vague and actually don't be meaningful in terms of what are our priorities in implementing the different pillars of the treaty. And going back to your question, Ian, I think that this is not so much a matter about, who pulled the trigger per se. I think it's more, and we need to put our views away from the process and understand that this might be something or might be a bigger structural problem vis-a-vis how it is conceived the review process of the treaty. And I know that we can, certainly, I hope that we will discuss this during the whole session. But one of the main problems that we had, or that at least I perceive that we have vis-a-vis the review process, is this notion that we always need a consensus-based document, an outcome document, in order to assess the process as a success. And certainly, I'm going to be one of the persons here today that will challenge that approach, that view, because I think that approach that we have had vis-a-vis the consensus-based outcome document, vis-a-vis the review process, has been one of the reasons why we have not advanced at all, or meaning, let's say, not at all. I don't want to sound very dramatic here. There have been advancements in the context of the NPT, but I think that those advancements have been minimal vis-a-vis what we can certainly we could have achieved. Um, and as a consequence, I think that yes, everyone was let's say everyone was alleviated when Russia pulled the trigger. However, I think that in any case, whether Russia pulled the trigger or not, or whether the concept or whether the outcome document would have passed, it's not the main issue here. The problem here is that we are assuming that that we must achieve and obtain an outcome document at any cost, and that's what the real problem lies in.
Manuel, you used the word meaningful, and I want to stay on that because in the PrepCom processes leading up to 2026, did state parties manage to build any meaningful pre conference ground on those fault lines, or are delegations arriving in New York on April 27th essentially picking up from where they walked out in 2022?
So, as per my experience during this review cycle that we are coming to an end, I think that basically speaking, the fault lines have been acknowledged in terms of we know what the problems have been in terms of the why we have not achieved consensus. Let's say that has been acknowledged by all the state parties as far as I can see, and this has led to something that for me it's quite shocking, which is to try to achieve even vaguer vocabulary. And the leitmotif for all this review cycle has been transparency and accountability. This has been the big concept that has been going out there in all the review cycle. Like, we need to be more transparent, more accountable. Of course, we ask more, or we demand more from the nuclear weapon states. But at the end of the day, we actually don't understand what that transparency and accountability either means, and how it must be, or how should it be put um, in functional terms.
I mean, I totally agree, which is why I haven't yet jumped in. But in terms of, whether we're picking up from where we left off in 2022, from an issue-centric perspective, given that I actually agree with everything Manuel said already procedurally, we're going into an unprecedented REFCON. The issues you highlight at at the beginning of the podcast, we have so many unprecedented actions in nuclear order that I suspect that many state parties will be going in there discombobulated because they have a rough idea of what the anxieties and, I would say, resentments of certain countries would be going into the REFCON, but we have no pre-understanding of what the intensity of these grievances would look like on the day, and also what the fallout of this intense grievances would look like vis-a-vis the different informal coalitions that states are party to. So, for example, Iran would be coming into this REFCON, even with regards to personnel, we're not entirely sure who has, what authority to speak on what, because governance has changed significantly so far in Iran and will change significantly by the time we get to the REFCON. Sticking to the topic of personnel in Iran, do we even know if they'll get a visa to actually be there at the REFCON? Right now, when we go past these hurdles to even know who's going to be in the room, are they going to focus on attacks on nuclear facilities from June and the recent attacks from the point of view of these things are illegal and they're against the Geneva Conventions? Or are they going to be looking to justify attacks on nuclear facilities in preparation for their own potential attacks on others' nuclear facilities? These are the substantive issues that we just simply have no read on, even with live intelligence feeds into some capitals. The NATO summit is going to be happening a month right after the RevCon. How is this going to feed into the, I guess, motivations for countries like France to either use the RevCon to announce forward deterrence, which is their new strategic autonomy tagline, or are they going to be quite silent in this regard, just waiting for the NATO summit to actually, unveil the next step of this forward deterrence plan? So, from an Asia-centric perspective, we're working into a RefCon that is unlike anything we've ever seen before. And I really wonder if many of the issues and fault lines that were valid even in 2025 would, you know, um, enjoy this sort of attention that they enjoyed in the last PrepCon. So it's really an upheaval RefCon, in my opinion, and we simply just don't know.
You raise a very important point there, and upheaval is exactly the right word. But let me add a layer to what you just described, because what you're really pointing to is not just uncertainty, it's a compounding of uncertainties that could each individually derail a conference, but are now all arriving simultaneously. We don't know who will be in the room. We don't know if Iran's delegation gets a visa to enter the United States. We don't know what authority they will have to speak or whether they will come to litigate the legality of strikes on their nuclear facilities or to signal something altogether more alarming about their own intentions going forward. The review conference clearly does not happen in a vacuum, and the political shadow being cast over the conference right now is longer and darker than anything we saw in 2022. But moving on to the next question, Manuel, is the conference entering a more dangerous room than 2022? And does that change what is even negotiable?
Sure. I mean, the thing for me in terms of whether we are entering into a more dangerous room, I think that we are, like, generally speaking, we are in a more dangerous world than even 1 year ago. Full stop. That's it. And you know, as per practice, we know that RefCons, the NPT, it's not isolated from global affairs. There is always this trend, this attempt to say like, oh no, we need to negotiate NPT issues, the three pillars in a purely objective, not being conditioned by world affairs. That's not feasible. So by essence, by pure logic, yes, we are entering a more dangerous room than in 2025, or well, than in 2022 for sure. Um, the question that we need to ask ourselves is whether, despite the NPT not living in a political vacuum, despite the NPT process, the review process being affected by all these events that we have been discussing, all these, so from the war in Ukraine, in Iran, and the potential incentives that some other states have in order to, proliferate, to become proliferators, whether we can at least try to address some basic elements in which we can um, go forward. I'm not in terms of the different pillars. So in terms of disarmament, I think it's not going to be. We will not be able to go forward quite a lot. But at least in terms of non-proliferation, trying to reaffirm the non-proliferation norm, and in terms of peaceful users pillar, try to make more clear, for instance, how to for one of the main issues that has been also discussed, like how to make accessible funding for the deployment of a specific nuclear science and technology. So all these elements, if we can at least try to advance in some of them, I would say that you can call it quite a success as a conference. So yes, we are entering into a more dangerous room, but still I think that hope might not be lost.
Just to build on what Manuela said, because my initial response was going to be, it's a more dangerous room with opportunities. So I think we're speaking, on a very similar trajectory here. Why I say more opportunities is because, some states that I've been speaking to have already foregone the idea that there's going to be an outcome document. They say, that we would much rather have a review conference that is vehemently defending the preamble and the values of the NPT, and because of that, an outcome document is not possible, than to have a review conference that continues this erosion on obligations to achieve an outcome document. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think this, dangerous room is actually a ripe opportunity now for the strengthened review process working group for some of the recommendations to be put in play, especially with regards to encouraging interactive debate in the plenary and in the different committees, because every I think every effort has to be channeled towards optimizing this review conference, not only as a review of the treaty, but as a review of the nuclear order that this treaty is the cornerstone of. And if you don't have the opportunity for interactive debate, the sorts that would allow for intense discussions and a wash up, then this treaty will be perceived as being so disconnected from international security realities that it wouldn't be seen as a reckoning house. So what might appear to be chaotic, having the review conference as, a wash-up session, actually has value for the legitimacy and relevance of this treaty as the only multilateral forum where nuclear issues of all kinds can be explicitly discussed.
Yes, and actually, also as an add up to what all I just said, as a follow up, is like I think that if state parties, because I think as all alike, there are opportunities here, and I think that despite the whole situation, there are opportunities, and there are the and if a state parties approach REFCON not so much in trying to achieve and obtain an outcome document, but at least to have fruitful conversations, fruitful debate on initiatives that can actually be implemented or developed in between review cycles. I mean, we can just call the REFCON to be a success, but we don't need an outcome document for that.
Manuel, you ended your answer with something that struck me. You said hope might not be lost. And I want to sit with that for a moment, right? Because underneath the optimism, there is a harder question about the proliferation norm itself. The lesson that many states appear to be drawing from Ukraine is that being a non nuclear weapon state makes you strategically vulnerable. And that calculation, that fear, is now openly shaping conversations in Tokyo, Seoul, and several European capitals, as we have seen in the past 4 years since the Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And this brings me to a point that Ola mentioned earlier. He said we are entering a dangerous room but with opportunity. So I just want to ask, does the non-proliferation norm itself come into that room under more pressure than it has in the past decades?
Absolutely. Um, but I think we can phrase this as a dual edged sword, double edged sword here. The proliferation norm is going to be under immense pressure from non-nuclear weapon states, especially those that are under nuclear umbrellas. Because let's not forget, nuclear umbrella states are still non-nuclear weapon states as well, and TPNW supporting states are also non-nuclear weapon states. The f- the proliferation norm is going to be under pressure because there is going to be, I'm quite certain, an articulation of changed security perspectives from states under umbrellas that would call for either more extended deterrence, more intensified extended deterrence, or independent nuclear arsenals of some kind. I'm sure the latter would be a bit too flamboyant for any state to reasonably propose, but there will be calls for extended deterrence, and these calls for extended deterrence would be tied to the non-proliferation norm from the perspective um, with which NATO's nuclear sharing was legitimized, which is that extended deterrence actually helps to stabilize the order because it, reduces incentives for proliferation. That's one side. The second side is that non-proliferation will come under immense pressure from non-nuclear weapon states that prioritize the disarmament pillar, because if we understand that this particular review conference is going to be, I guess, the judgment day for the norm of non-proliferation in and of itself, that actually opens an opportunity for some states that want to prioritize disarmament over non-proliferation to commingle and entangle, acquiescence on disarmament language for them to provide their support for non-proliferation language, if you see what I mean there. And I'm looking at the TPNW crowd in this sense, where they're going to hold the line and they're going to say as well that we have security concerns, and these security concerns exist because of the existence of deterrence as a practice, and so we're not going to give an inch or listen to other states in nuclear umbrellas saying that actually nuclear sharing is in their interests. And we're going to see a clash of these two, very much so. But here's a third interesting angle, I think, that's going to come out of this. China has been repeatedly prodding to get responses, especially from NATO states and states under NATO's nuclear umbrella. China continues to question the legitimacy of nuclear sharing, even though this is a discussion that I think had been concluded many review cycles ago. But the reason I suspect that they continue to press on this issue is because of the anticipated response, which is that if we share our nuclear weapons within a security alliance, keeping command and control or surety of these weapons with the state that is actually sending these weapons to a host state, then we're still within the obligations, Article 1 and 2 of the NPT. But then when you take this argument further, you can see how this can easily legitimize copycat nuclear sharing that's already happening in the eastern flank of NATO, where they're already beginning to articulate nuclear sharing in Belarus as actually being in line with NPT obligations and interpretations as we've seen, from NATO, where the tactical nuclear weapons that have been stationed there, we can call them forward deployed, are still under the command and control of Moscow, right? And then these two states are actually union states in a security alliance. So how is it different? So this sort of third way that I'm seeing increasing pressure on from China, I think, is going to be one to watch.
You just introduced something I want to push on, the idea that some states will use acquiescence on disarmament language as a bargaining chip for non-proliferation language. And I want to say something that might actually be controversial, um, in this field, and I suspect many people are not yet ready to have this conversation, but I think we need to realize how disarmament has become the graveyard of outcome documents. And this is nothing against disarmament prospects. I just think at some point in this field, we need to be more pragmatic on what we can actually achieve in the short term. And due to this deadlock on disarmament and the continuation to place it at the center of review conferences um, that are already operating in the most fractured geopolitical environment the NPT has ever seen, may be the surest way to guarantee a third consecutive failure. But I digress. With New START expired, no bilateral arms control architecture between Washington and Moscow, and the nuclear weapon states modernizing rather than reducing, as we have already pointed out, what is the disarmament pillar actually standing on right now?
The summit pillar is not standing on much if you look at it with a fine tooth comb. And what I mean is, we have Article 6 of the NPT, which is an obligation for nuclear weapon states to negotiate in good faith disarmament. Now, we have explored, and many, disarmament prioritizing states have explored and put a lot of pressure on nuclear weapon states to not qualify their future negotiations on disarmament, to not qualify it on like the current international security environment. So don't tell us that disarmament is not possible because it's too dangerous now to consider. However, an underexplored avenue of Article 6 is actually the legal obligation to negotiate in good faith. And good faith in itself can be categorized as giving differentiated obligations to nuclear weapon states, but also non nuclear weapon states in the treaty. Good faith, on the perspective of nuclear weapon states, is to ensure that their nuclear modernization, however necessary they say it may be, nuclear sharing, alliances, all of these things, still has to be explained, articulated from a perspective of we need to explain why these things are happening in order to maintain that good faith perspective with non-nuclear weapon states. Whereas from the non-nuclear weapon state perspective, they have the obligations to pursue this good faith agenda in the sense that if they stay silent on the eroding arms control architecture, on the vertical increases of nuclear weapons and whatnot, then they can also be said to be abdicating their responsibilities under the treaty to encourage and enable, you know, disarmament negotiations in good faith.
Again, I want to push back on the good faith argument because what I'm hearing is that states keep pushing on disarmament so they are not seen as having abandoned it. But to what effect? When time and again it remains the place where consensus goes to die. On what basis do we still call this progress?
I think the pushback in itself, the current pushback in itself, is actually progress. It sounds counterintuitive, but if, for example, in 2022 or in 2015, states didn't hold the line on disarmament obligations and they were okay to water down, political commitments that appeared in the final documents of those review conferences, you can easily see how there would be continued erosion, where nuclear weapon states and their alliances that are under, security pressures to expand or give more credibility to their deterrence would find any loophole to push Article 6 further down the line. Now, if you give any leeway in any review conference on this issue, you end up setting a precedent for the next review conference. And that's just one, aspect of the requirement to continue, pushing for disarmament from non-nuclear weapon states' perspectives. The second is, of course, the almost global effects of any sort of large-scale nuclear conflict. So, from this perspective, non-nuclear weapon states have security interest obligations to ensure that nuclear conflict does not occur and that they reduce the risks that come from nuclear deterrence, because from their perspective it's in their security interest to turn nuclear risks to zero. So although it does create a lot of animosity with regards to getting a consensus document and a Kumbaya review conference, I think it goes back to an earlier point I made that it would be much better for a review conference to not have an outcome document because of strict adherence to the values of the treaty than for it to get an outcome document where some values are forgotten in the name of being productive.
Manuel, Ola just brought us to security concerns as the language that might actually bridge the gap between nuclear and non nuclear states. The TPNW sits right in the middle of that tension. Does it raise the floor of what non nuclear states will accept in NPT disarmament language, making consensus harder, or has it given states an off ramp, letting them signal commitment to abolition outside the NPT and lower their demands inside it?
I don't think that the TPNW has changed the reference point for non-nuclear weapon states. It has changed the reference point for some non-nuclear weapon states. There are other many non-nuclear weapon states that don't agree with the TPNW, and of course they are not party to the treaty. Therefore, I think that for a significant group or significant number of non-nuclear weapon states, the TPNW is not considered a viable tool in order to proceed with the conversations on the implementation of Article 6. Despite the fact that the TPNW acknowledges the NPT as a cornerstone of the regime and acknowledges the role that aims to um, fulfill the vagueness of Article 6. So I don't think that in any case TPNW can be seen by the state parties as a whole, by all the state parties of the treaty of the NPT, as a useful tool to achieve disarmament. I think that, and as far as we know, based also on the conversations that took place during the 2022 REFCON and during this whole review cycle, um, you know, I think that also because of the aim of consensus, all the discussions regarding TPNW and all the language regarding TPNW has tried systematically to be put outside from any uh, draft. So the only consensus that we can see so far right now, it's like TPNW, in the inclusion of TPNW language into the outcome document will not be productive in order to achieve such an outcome document. And I think that, as you know, as Ola was mentioning before, like um, reaffirming the value of the implementation of Article 6 and reaffirming the values that has as part of the whole nuclear non-proliferation regime will be more effective on the long term for achieving disarmament, and explaining why, for instance, we are not in a position right now to implement Article 6, like an exercise of transparency that we are, because again, the leitmotif of transparency and accountability, if we are able to explain right now why that's not achievable in this moment because of XYZ factors, that will help more to the cause of nuclear disarmament in the future than the TPNW.
Let me jump in there to also sort of give a slightly different strand of an answer. Um, I would say the TPNW has clarified the reference point of non-nuclear weapon states in relation to disarmament obligations. As Manuel highlighted initially, a lot of the advocacy for the TPNW was around the moral argument against the existence of nuclear weapons as a category. Um, and this was, optimized to attempt to stigmatize nuclear weapons and also, legally abolish them. That has not happened, and that wasn't perhaps the most effective way to create dialogue between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, even though it was the most effective way to raise public pressure amongst the populaces within democratic nuclear weapon states. But because I think of the failure of this to gain traction in diplomatic circles, the humanitarian argument in and of itself, I think, is a positive development that comes out of the TPNW for two reasons. The humanitarian argument reconnects the possible applicability of international humanitarian law on the conditions and the designs of the nuclear deterrence doctrines of different countries. Now, I am not entirely sure that nuclear deterrence, or at least the use of a nuclear weapon in most scenarios, can ever be in line with international humanitarian law unless somebody decides to explode a tactical nuke in the South Atlantic or something, right? But this reconnection with international humanitarian law has actually forced for even countries like the US to become a little bit more vocal about the processes that go on, the legal processes that go on behind the scenes when they're developing their predetermined target lists for the Black Book for the president. You didn't really see the US paying attention to talking about, oh, we have lawyers and we have these reviews before we actually target places. Still a very weak argument because of the effect of these weapons, but the fact that nuclear weapon states are talking about it in this dynamic actually opens up for a third opportunity that I think is now being developed, although I think grudgingly by some TPNW states more than others, and that is the security argument I mentioned before. The security argument, I think, has been better welcomed by nuclear weapon states because finally TPNW states are speaking loosely the same language as nuclear weapon states when they only speak in security terms. Because nuclear weapon states would say, we need these weapons because we have adversaries that are already targeting us with their weapons, and so we need to deter them, and we also need to have second strike survivability and all of these things because we need to protect our people. Now, non-nuclear weapon states say a similar thing, where the existence of these weapons threaten our people because you can't contain the impact of these weapons. Now we're all talking about national security concerns. Now we can get to, more detailed discussions about, okay, so if you're concerned about the globalized effects of nuclear weapons use, have we studied to even see what the actual impact would be? And so we have the UN panel of experts that are looking at the impact of nuclear war. I wish it was much better resourced, but we're beginning to get a little bit more into the nitty gritty of what would actually happen if deterrence fails. Other discussions related to this is the more proactive stance of nuclear weapons free zones that are now beginning to articulate their security concerns as well. And here, there's actually an opportunity for dialogue, structured dialogue between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states with regards to the stationing of weapons, the basing of weapons, the recognition of nuclear weapons free zones, the guarantees that come with, signing the protocols of these zones. And I think all of this has actually come out of the TPNW, not intentionally, but organically. Because, and this is my final point, because the TPNW has become one of the few spaces where these discussions could actually happen simultaneously or almost in parallel with discussions about disarmament in the NPT, because the TPNW has its own review cycle, its own meetings of state parties, and all of that. And so there's been much more opportunities for these states to coordinate their positions in the TPNW review cycle, where they can then articulate these positions in a way that wouldn't be too detrimental to existing language in the NPT. So here I think there is something going for the TPNW if they stick to the security concerns dynamic and language.
So, no, I think I think that the aim was to create normative pressure, what we call the stigmatization of nuclear weapon states, but I think that that has not happened. As a consequence, TPNW right now, for me, it's more a what we call a comatose legal instrument. It's something that it's legally binding because it has entered into force. Okay, we all know that. Everyone acknowledges that. Even France acknowledges that. But still, it's an instrument that it's going to be useful only in the moment that we have achieved the good faith in order to be implemented properly by the nuclear weapon states.
Manuel, you called the TPNW a comatose legal instrument. legally binding but functionally inert until nuclear weapon states are ready to engage with it in good faith. Uh, Ola, I want to bring that back to the agency argument because does this moment with proliferation signals rising on multiple fronts make this the most critical juncture to reinvigorate nonproliferation at the review conference, precisely because the window to hold the norm together may be closing?
I think it presents an opportunity to fundamentally revisit the assumptions that make up the global nonproliferation order. Um, Now, this is an opportunity that could break the NPT, for all we know, but it's an opportunity where there's so many examples of things going wrong with regards to non-proliferation, even counter-proliferation, that there has to be a reckoning on two fronts. The first is, do we want to preserve a world where non-proliferation is done by multilateral international law means? Or have we forgone all of the architecture we've developed through inspections and safeguards and whatnot, and now we now moving into a world where if you try to get a nuke like Iran, we're going to bomb you into the ground. You don't need the NPT if this is the world we're moving into, right? The all options are on the table. If you remember that from the end of Biden's presidency, do we need the NPT then? Can we, have forced kinetic counterproliferation? And so when this question is being considered, and if you take out, non-proliferation from the NPT, what do you have left? What do you have left to lose if this treaty were to collapse? I can tell you much of the global South countries, as much as they want to, pursue disarmament and whatnot, I can tell you they are very aware that no other treaty has a provision that gives them inalienable rights to a specific technology that they can continue to refer to in their clamoring for this technology. Article 4 of the NPT. You know, no other treaty has an obligation on nuclear weapon states that they've signed to at least at some point in the future negotiate good faith. And so, you know, it's going to be dangerous for the treaty if it doesn't live up to being a space that can be self-reflective of the goals and objectives of the treaty. I just want to highlight one thing though, and this is something that gives me a bit of trepidation. Um, in a workshop not very long ago with a lot of NPT state parties present, nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, I asked a very simple question, and the president of the NPT was there. I said, how confident are we that if we just take the preamble text of the NPT and we say, hey, this preamble text is the final outcome document and we need everyone to sign off on this, how confident are we that they would actually sign on the preamble of the treaty as a valid outcome document? And the room was silent. And that gave me some cause for concern.
That silence in the room when you asked whether states would even agree to the preamble of their own treaty, that is one of the most alarming things I've heard in a long time. And it takes directly to the question of the outcome document. Manuel, is the NPT review process fit for purpose in a world this polarized? I know we hinted at this question earlier on in the episode, but this is very important to understand, and this is very important for us to articulate. Is the 5 year consensus required cycle structurally broken, or is the mechanism sound and the political will simply absent?
So, I mean, the starting point for answering that question is to acknowledge the fact that the MPT has and actually was created, was conceptualized in a polarized world during the Cold War, where you had they has these two big powers, the US and the Soviet Union, with different points of view, with different worldviews about how the world should work, and still, despite their polarized point of view, they were able to reach consensus to build up this this legal instrument. Of course, in a very pragmatic way, and because they, to some extent, acknowledge, let's say, the challenges of not keeping this kind of weaponry under control. You know, we all remember. Well, we don't remember because we were not there, but we have read, all of us, about the Cuban missile crisis. And as a consequence, despite the polarization of the time, they had to reach consensus on this point. And you know, so this is not the so basically, let's say that a polarized world has always been part, to some extent, of the NPT. The question that we need to ask ourselves is not so much whether the fact that the polarized international system it's a factor that can or cannot affect the NPT. Um, it's whether, again, whether reaching an outcome consensus document, it's the only way to assess the correct functioning of the review process. And I think that this is the point that we need to actually challenge. The review process, it's fit for purpose. It was very well designed and was designed in such a way that cannot be reformed. And I recommend all of you, I mean, certainly, or anyone who is listening to this podcast, to read Article 8 of the MPT and see all the requirements for reform. So the review process and the treaty by itself was actually created in such a way that cannot be reformed, and so it was fit for purpose for for that single reason. So we will have to stick with the 5-year review process, either we like it or not. That's how it is. However, what we need to reconceptualize is what success in the context of the review process means. And again, as I was pointing out or giving a hint before, the idea is not so much about obtaining the outcome document, but trying to put forward in the agenda initiatives and proposals that allow for their further development and implementation in between the review cycles. Exa- the best example I can think about is the additional protocol. I know that there are many countries that are quite skeptical about the additional protocol, but still, the additional protocol, its conceptualization and its later development came out from a review conference that was unsuccessful, the 1990 review conference. And then later on was negotiated outside, or well, was negotiated in between review conferences, in between review cycles, and at the end was adopted in 1997, 1988, with some specific edits and amendments, but in any case, was actually uh, taken forward as a result of a review conference that was not successful in theory because we did not achieve an outcome document. So again, if we are able to put forward initiatives vis-a-vis all the pillars and also aspects that are not from the pillars, let's say nuclear weapons free zones, and also, for instance, agreement regarding the withdrawal provision, because that's, for instance, one provision that does not fit inside any of the pillar, but it's also quite important. Um, and we are able to take the work beyond the review cycle, then I would say that that can be qualified as successful. So the problem is not the polarization of the international system. The system has always been polarized to some extent. The problem is not about how the review cycle and how the treaty is structured. We know that it's a treaty that has been built up in such a way that cannot be reformed, and we need to work with what we have. The problem is about reconceptualizing how we measure and assess success of a review cycle.
I completely agree with you on that, Manuel. The additional protocol example is one I want to stay with for a second because the 1990 review conference, the one that produced no consensus outcome document, the one that was filed away as a failure, gave us the additional protocol, which was adopted in 1997. And it remains one of the most significant verification tools in the entire nonproliferation regime. So, was that conference really a failure when we weigh all these benefits that we got from 1990? And that is exactly the point that we keep circling back to in this conversation. The way we weigh success and failure in NPT review conferences needs to be fundamentally re-evaluated. Because if a conference with no consensus outcome document gave us the additional protocol, and a conference that did produce a consensus document gave us language so diluted it meant nothing, which one actually moved the regime forward? But it makes me ask the harder version of the question. If 2026 produces no outcome document and no initiative is carried forward into the next review cycle, no additional protocol moment waiting in the wings, what is the long term consequence? Drift and erosion or something more serious?
Well, let's gonna assume that we assume that uh, a failure of the conference would be the lack of adoption of a consensus-based document. If that's our departing point, like our starting point for this assessment, then I think, personally speaking, that nothing more will change. Like it's gonna be a very progressive erosion of the non-proliferation norm, non-proliferation and disarmament norm, but nothing really, really incredible will change in international non-proliferation regime. Um, the only problem that I see is that failure in adopting an outcome document, sorry, is not sustained or is not jointly taken forward with other specific set of initiatives in order to reinvigorate the norm. Because yes, we can fail to adopt an outcome document. That it's not the first time. Okay, that's fine. The problem is like, okay, we fail. What initiatives are we going to put on the table for the next review cycle in order to reinvigorate the norm? If we are not able to do that, then that's going to have major consequences, because as we were discussing before, and as all I was saying, like the non-proliferation norm can be in the coming years can be put under huge stress. And what happens if we start to fail in the implementation of the non-proliferation norm? What happens if safeguards are not being fully implemented? What happens if, for instance, we adopt uh, pure kinetic force in order to adopt counter-proliferation measures? What if countries that we thought that they would never proliferate, such as South Korea or Japan or even Iran, for the sake of it, based because of the situation right now, decide to proliferate? If we are not able to put on the table proposals in order to avoid that and reinvigorate the norm for non-proliferation, uh, and for the treaty as a whole. So other initiatives will have to be adopted as well, vis-a-vis the other pillars. So Article 6, Article 4, but and also other provisions of the pillar, Article 7, and the provision for withdrawal, to be further clarified and to put conditions for withdrawal. Then, if we are not able to do that, then we will have a huge problem in the future.
Progressive erosion. And that takes us to the question of what we are actually measuring success against. Ola, there have been two consecutive failed conferences, right? A third risks normalizing failure entirely, and we don't want that. But a watered down consensus document, language so diluted it commits states to nothing, may do equal damage to the regime's credibility. What could possibly be a third option for us to avoid such a scenario?
There is a third way, and that is thinking creatively with regards to what success looks like from a review conference, or at least from a meeting meant to cast judgment on the effective, functioning of the MPT. I think a third way is a meeting, a review conference that is not tethered to an outcome document, so tethered that it forgets what the core values and aims of the treaty is. And so this third way would be to utilize the MPT and its recurring frequency as a sort of checkpoint where nuclear issues evolving as they are thoroughly focused on and dealt with. And I think that in itself should be a marker of success or failure of the MPT in the sense that is this review conference able to effectively deal with and deliberate on emerging nuclear risks and opportunities that are currently happening? Or is this review conference going to be so detached from reality that nobody necessarily needs to pay attention to it because it has no bearing on our understanding of evolving risks and opportunities in the nuclear order? I think this is the third way. But the review cycle and the review conference run into structural limits in this regard, where we've already seen very much through the strengthening the review process working group of the MPT, how certain dynamics of speaking, of splitting up the different issues across the three main committees, of having deliberations more in informal spaces as opposed to plenaries, these structural dynamics actually hinder the review conference from being that space of reckoning that it needs to be. That is one thing. Secondly, I think having a third review conference that fails to achieve an outcome document is a marker of failure to an extent, yes. But having a third review conference that fails to even, obtain some sort of consensus view on the continued application or continued applicability of political commitments that were made in the previously successful review conferences of 2010 and 2000, I think that would be a deeper failure. Where, we agree to things in the text of the treaty to start off with. And Article 6 is one of those contentious um, articles because this is where many states see that state parties to the NPT don't seem to even recognize the continued validity of Article 6, or at least in the way that they understand it. That's one layer. Now, these are legal commitments in the treaty, but states have, you know, undertaken political commitments as well. In 2000, in 2010, in 1995, although that was the Review and Extension Conference. What do these political commitments that states clearly undertook at those review conferences mean for state conduct today? If we are saying that the agreements taken in 2000 and the agreements taken in 2010 are completely out of date and no longer binding on states that undertook these agreements, then what is the point of an outcome document in the NPT Review Conference going forward if political agreements that are the reason these outcome documents are so important anyways no longer apply in the future? So do we agree to things in 2026 and then completely forget about them and say, hey, that was for 2026's world. It's 2031 now. It doesn't apply. So, there's a few different ways to really understand what is the point of success. How do we conceive of it? And what is the point of, holding on to an outcome document as the litmus test for success at the NPT?
This deserves more attention than it gets because here's the reality: there is no formal enforcement or implementation mechanism for NPT outcome documents. They are politically binding, not legally binding. Each review conference is supposed to assess implementation of the previous one, but when conferences fail, that assessment doesn't happen. And even when they succeed, the commitments tend to fade. The 2010 Action Plan, 64 concrete steps, is widely acknowledged to be largely unimplemented, and some states now argue those commitments are no longer even valid. So, what we are really asking is if states agree to something in 2026, assuming they agree to anything at all, what actually guarantees it means something by 2031, for instance? Is there a process? Is anyone keeping score?
Absolutely. Here's what happens, or what I've observed happens. So the 13 steps, 2000, are being treated sort of like good faith is being treated in Article 6 of the NPT. The further these agreements, you know, go in our rearview mirror, the more we sort of have a hazy recollection of what they actually were meant to achieve. And so we're treating them like North Stars. So when we talk about 13 practical steps now, we almost immediately follow it with the 64-point action plan. The 64-point action plan from 2010, still more recent in our memory, but also much more contested when we recollect what happened there. What I mean by much more contested is this. On one layer, many states say that many, of the points in the 64-point action plan were fit for purpose in 2010 security environment, but is no longer applicable today. Some organizations, like Reaching Critical Will, a couple of years did monitor where they looked at all of the different points of the 64-point action plan to see which of these points were being implemented or even like recognized and which of these points were still alive. And they had a RAG system, a red, amber, green system of identifying which of these points were still sort of alive, and most of the points were in amber or red, except when it came to Pillar 3 issues, if I recall correctly. Um, and this is interesting because, you know, if you talk about the 64-point action plan today with many, even non nuclear weapon states, you get the sense that there's more than meets the eye with regards to how these points were agreed and how different delegations feel obliged or otherwise to comply with these points. When we're thinking about past review conferences and their outcomes, we forget that these outcomes were not perfect outcome documents and they were not perfect consensus documents. There was a lot of language that differentiated between what all the states thought, some of the states thought, most of the states thought. And so this sort of language gymnastics the precedents of review conferences had to play to secure consensus actually weakened the language of obligation when this document was actually secured. And so if you go back with a fine tooth comb to this sort of language, you can more easily undermine certain parts of this language and therefore, find loopholes with regards to the um, sort of clarity of obligations that political agreements in the 64-point action plan actually had. The other thing is the differentiation between the backward-looking parts of the documents and forward-looking parts of the documents is important because the 64-point action plan was a forward-looking part of the 2010 outcome document, and many will be quick to tell you that this forward-looking action plan wasn't agreed by consensus, just a backward-looking review. So what does this, mean for the salience of political agreements in the NPT, but also, you know, the meaning of success from the NPT review process writ large? It's a question we're still grappling with, but it's good for the readers and listeners to have an idea of how complicated it is to even articulate what past successes were, to actually conceive of what potential success could look like going forward in this process.
We are a couple of weeks away from the review conference now, and it sounds like a lot of what we should have been building on is already fading in the review mirror. If you could sit down with the conference president right now, what is the one thing you would tell him?
Well, that's a that's a big question. So Personally, I will try to recommend the chair, like the president of the conference, to try don't to try to don't focus so much on the outcome document, to try to don't focus so much on trying to accommodate every single position of every single state party, or every single of the blocks that actually form the 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 MPT. Try to focus more on identifying what are perceived like the main shortcomings in terms of implementing the treaty through all the pillars, and try to make sure to propose, even if it's not radical proposals, even if not something really that's going to be groundbreaking for the implementation of those specific concerns, for the advancement of those specific concerns, but try to already think about, okay, this is not going to work now because we just reached the end of the review cycle and nothing has happened, but that's going to try to put forward a specific practical initiative and try to coordinate ourselves with the IEA, CTBTO, and other organizations that are part of the non-proliferation regime in order to try to advance through those specific concerns that the city parties might have vis-a-vis the implementation of the treaty.
If I could make him do anything, this would be interesting. If I could make him do anything, I would tell him to put the preamble of the Treaty of the NPT on the table in week one as the outcome document of the review conference for states to agree on. If that is too divisive, too difficult for any president to achieve, and this is a very skilled diplomat, he is a very skilled president. If even him is not able to get states to agree to what they've already agreed to in the text of this treaty, then why pretend that it's possible with any sort of document he could develop on his own based on consultations with different parties to the treaty.
Just before I let both of you go, I have one last question. Starting with you, Manuel, as the program manager of the Nonproliferation and Disarmament Program at BASIC, what programs are you working on in line with the review conference that is ahead of us?
Actually, yes. I'm very glad to announce that we have finally launched this month the output of our main project, which is the NPT Monitor, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Monitor, which actually it's a web tool, is a website that assesses or tries to assess the degree of implementation of the treaty of the NPT by its state parties. So actually, it's not so much an accountability tool. I mean, our work is not so much to deal with accountability, but it's a transparency tool for all the state parties of the treaty and also the research community, academics, CSOs, think tanks, that want to have access in a simplified and concise manner or way to the information provided by the nuclear weapon states on their implementation of the treaty. So all that information will be made public through that website. Basically, what we are doing in order to make that assessment, or what we have done in order to make that assessment, is to take the 2010 64 action plan as a benchmark in terms of implementation of the treaty. So we assess, basically, we have the three pillars of the treaty, we have the articles of the treaty that engage with each one of those three pillars, and then we have divided each one of the 64 action plan actions as part of those three pillars. And based on that, what we have done is hired country experts, what we call country experts, which are nationals from each one of the five nuclear weapon states that have expertise in their so they speak the native language and they have the expertise on their national nuclear policies, in order to make a recompilation of all the available data and information, public available data and information on the engagement of their countries with each one of the 64 actions of the action plan.
And Ola, As engagement specialist at the Open Nuclear Network, is there something you're currently working on that you would want to share with our listeners?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking that. We're actually working on a very exciting project called Project Loop, which actually is a new way of looking at emerging nuclear risks in our field. Now, we're very used to traditional qualitative analysis, research papers, OPEDs, and that's usually how we filter out what nuclear experts think is, the next trajectory in nuclear weapons risk. At Project Loop, we're basing all of our analysis on forecasting the probability of specific events happening in a predetermined time frame. And the reason we're doing this is because it actually increases to a big extent the objectivity of our findings, the objectivity of our analysis, but also increases very much so the accountability of our analysis. Where when you have to put a number on something, saying, you know, uh, this, a nuclear warhead might be used sometime in the next 6 months in the Korean Peninsula, versus saying we are 11% sure that a nuclear warhead of this type would be used before the 24th of June 2026. When you have to make that sort of probabilistic estimate, you begin to look at every factor that could potentially impact that probability. And so this is the sort of new thinking that we're bringing to the field to actually increase the accountability of nuclear expertise, and also to increase the clarity of what we're actually trying to say, so that our findings are much more actionable intelligence for policymakers that need to do something about nuclear risk. So I'm very excited for the outcomes of the project, and we're going to be sharing, more and more our estimates to the wider field, so that, policymakers could actually take action on the different trends that we're tracking.
Ola and Manuel, thank you very much for joining the nuclear table today. This has been a very substantive discussion.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure to join you, and also great to discuss with Manuel from Basic. This was plenty fun.
Many thanks for inviting me.
The NPT was built on a bargain. States without nuclear weapons agreed not to acquire them in exchange for a genuine commitment from those who held them to eventually give them up. 55 years later, the bargain is under more strain than at any point since the treaty entered into force. What this conversation made clear is that the problem is not the treaty and it is not the review process. The problem is that we have forgotten how to measure success, and in chasing a consensus document at any cost, we have been willing to accept language so diluted it says nothing, or to walk out with nothing at all and call both of these outcomes a crisis. Ola put it best: a conference that defends the values of this treaty without an outcome document is better than one that produces a hollow text and calls it a win. Manuel put it structurally: the additional protocol, one of the most important tools in the nonproliferation regime, came out of a conference that was considered a failure. The question for this RevCon is not whether state parties can agree on a document, it is whether they can agree on what this treaty is still for. This has been the Nuclear Table, and I'm your host, Dr. Ian Fleming Shaw. Until next time.